The steady beep of the heart monitor was the first sound I became aware of as consciousness slowly returned to me. My eyelids felt like lead weights, and when I finally managed to open them, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made me squint. Everything was white. The walls, the ceiling, the blanket covering my body. The antiseptic smell filled my nostrils, and I could taste something metallic in my mouth. I tried to move, but my body felt foreign, weak, like it belonged to someone else. My throat was raw, and when I attempted to speak, only a raspy whisper emerged. A nurse appeared at my bedside almost immediately, her face a mixture of surprise and professional concern. According to YouTube analytics, 99.5% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me? She asked, leaning closer. Her name tag read, Jennifer, you're in St. Mary's Hospital. You've been in a coma for 3 months. 3 months. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered fragments driving home from my job at the marketing firm, the rain making the roads slick, and then, nothing. The accident that had stolen 3 months of my life. My parents. I managed to croak out. Where are my parents? Jennifer's expression shifted, becoming uncomfortable. She glanced away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. Let me get Dr. Rodriguez. He'll want to examine you now that you're awake. But I caught her wrist gently as she turned to leave. Please. My parents. Are they here? The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know, even before she spoke. Sarah? I think it's best if you focus on your recovery right now. Doctor. Rodriguez will be right in. Over the next few days, as my strength slowly returned and the fog in my mind cleared, I pieced together the truth from overheard conversations between nurses and the uncomfortable silences that followed my repeated questions about my family. My parents, David and Margaret Chen, the people who had raised me, who I had called every Sunday without fail, who had always been my safety net, had visited for the first week. Then their visits became sporadic. By the end of the first month, they had stopped coming altogether. They said you were as good as gone. Jennifer finally admitted one evening when I pressed her again. She was clearly violating some unspoken protocol, but I could see the sympathy in her eyes. They said there was no point in maintaining hope for someone who would never be the same again. Even if you did wake up. The physical pain from my injuries, a traumatic brain injury, several broken bones, internal bleeding, had been manageable with medication. But this revelation felt like a knife twisting in my chest. While I had been fighting for my life in the darkness of unconsciousness, they had written me off. Not just written me off, they had abandoned me entirely. Did anyone else visit? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Jennifer shook her head. I'm sorry, honey. Just your parents, those first few weeks. And then, no one. That night, I stared at the ceiling and felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. Not just hurt that would have been too simple. This was betrayal on a level I had never imagined possible. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had decided I wasn't worth their time when I needed them most. I spent the next 2 weeks in physical therapy, rebuilding my strength and motor skills. The doctors were amazed at my recovery rate, apparently. I was one of the lucky ones who would make a near-complete recovery. It's remarkable, doctor. Rodriguez told me. Some patients take months or even years to get back to where you are now. But I wasn't thinking about luck. I was thinking about justice. During my recovery, I started asking questions, not just about my condition, but about everything that had happened while I was unconscious. I learned that my parents had cleaned out my apartment, citing the need to handle Sarah's affairs. Since I was unlikely to recover, they had sold my car, the one that had been destroyed in the accident, and pocketed the insurance money. They had also accessed my bank accounts using power of attorney documents they had somehow obtained while I was incapacitated. How is that possible? I asked the hospital's patient advocate, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson. Unfortunately, it's more common than you'd think, she explained. When someone is in a coma with uncertain prognosis, family members often need to make financial decisions. If they had power of attorney, I never gave them power of attorney, I said firmly. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. That's concerning. You might want to speak with a lawyer. That afternoon, I called Mitchell and Associates, a law firm I found online that specialized in financial abuse cases. When I explained my situation to attorney Michael Mitchell, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Miss Chen, he finally said, what you're describing isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. If you never granted power of attorney and they forged documents or used fraud to access your accounts, we're talking about identity theft, forgery, and theft. How much money are we talking about? I had been afraid to check, but with his encouragement, I accessed my online banking from the hospital computer. The number on the screen made my stomach lurch. Of the $47,000 I had saved over the years, money for a down payment on a house, my emergency fund, everything I had worked for, only $3,200 remained. They took almost everything. I whispered into the phone. I'm coming to see you tomorrow, Mitchell said. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we meet. The next morning, Michael Mitchell turned out to be a man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that hardened when I showed him the bank statements and told him about my parents' disappearance from my life. Sarah, I want you to understand something, he said after reviewing the documents. This isn't just a civil matter. What your parents did, assuming they forged power of attorney documents and stole your money, these are felonies. We're talking about criminal charges. Good, I said, surprising myself with the venom in my voice. Mitchell studied my face. Are you sure? These are your parents. Once we start this process, there's no going back. They could face years in prison. I thought about the nights I had lain awake in that hospital bed, wondering if I was truly alone in the world. I thought about the fear that had consumed me when I realized I had nowhere to go when I was discharged. No one to help me rebuild my life. I thought about how they had taken not just my money, but my security, my future, my ability to start over after the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I'm sure, I said. The investigation moved faster than I had expected. Within a week, Mitchell had uncovered the forged power of attorney documents, crude forgeries that wouldn't have held up to any real scrutiny. My parents had apparently counted on the fact that a comatose person wouldn't be checking their bank statements. The bank is cooperating fully, Mitchell told me during one of his visits. They're embarrassed. This happened, and want to make it right. Your parents withdrew money over several weeks, always staying just under the amounts that would trigger additional scrutiny. How did they know how to do that? I asked. Your father worked in banking for 30 years before he retired, Mitchell reminded me. He knew exactly what he was doing. As the criminal case built momentum, I was discharged from the hospital. With most of my money gone and my apartment rented to someone else, I had nowhere to go. The hospital's social worker helped me find a small efficiency apartment, and I used what little remained in my account for the deposit and first month's rent. Living in that tiny space, surrounded by the few possessions I had left, mostly items the hospital had collected from my wrecked car, I felt the full weight of what my parents had done. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my foundation, my ability to recover and rebuild after my accident. But as the weeks passed, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. I started working with a vocational counselor to get back into the workforce. My previous employer, remarkably, offered me a part-time position to help with my transition back to work. I began rebuilding, penny by penny, day by day. And through it all, I waited for the phone call that would tell me my parents had been arrested. It came on a Tuesday morning in November. Mitchell's voice was triumphant. They've been arrested, Sarah. Both your parents. Fraud, Identity theft, elder abuse. The DA is throwing the book at them. Elder abuse? I asked. I'm 28. Abuse of a vulnerable adult? He clarified. Someone who was incapacitated and couldn't defend themselves. It carries the same penalties. That afternoon, I saw their mugshots on the local news website. David and Margaret Chen, both looking older than I remembered, staring into the police camera with expressions of shock and disbelief. The news story was brief but damning. Local couple arrested for allegedly stealing from daughter in Coma. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month. As the victim, I had the right to attend, and I intended to exercise that right. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, my parents' lawyer, a public defender named Patricia Vance, reached out to Mitchell about a plea deal. They wanted to avoid jail time in exchange for full restitution and community service. What do you think? Mitchell asked me. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about mercy and forgiveness and moving on. I thought about the parents who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bicycle, and had celebrated my college graduation, and had once told me they were proud of the woman I had become. Then I thought about lying in that hospital bed, abandoned and alone, while they systematically stole everything I had worked for. No deal, I told Mitchell. I want my day in court. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit I had bought specifically for the occasion. I wanted to look professional, composed, strong, everything my parents apparently hadn't believed I could be again. The courthouse was smaller than I had expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that reminded me uncomfortably of the hospital. I arrived early and sat in the gallery, watching as other cases were called and resolved. Lawyers whispered to their clients, judges made pronouncements, and life went on with mechanical efficiency. Then I heard the bailiff call, "The People versus David Chen and Margaret Chen." My parents entered through the side door, flanked by their lawyer. They looked smaller somehow, diminished. My father's hair was grayer than I remembered, and my mother had lost weight. They were both wearing their best clothes, the same outfits they had worn to my college graduation. As they made their way to the defendant's table, my father's eyes swept the courtroom. When his gaze found me, he stopped walking so abruptly that my mother bumped into him. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like terror. He grabbed my mother's arm and whispered something to her. When she looked in my direction, her face went white. "Your Honor," Patricia Vance was saying, "we're here today for the preliminary hearing in the matter of..." But my parents weren't listening. They were staring at me with expressions of pure shock, as if they were seeing a ghost. Which, I realized, they essentially were. The daughter they had written off, the girl they had left to die alone in a hospital room, was sitting in their courtroom, very much alive and holding them accountable. My mother's legs seemed to give out. She gripped the defense table for support, her knuckles white. My father's face had gone gray, and he was breathing hard. Patricia Vance noticed something was wrong and turned to follow their gaze. When she saw me, understanding dawned on her face. She had clearly expected the victim to be either absent or still incapacitated. The living, breathing, articulate young woman in the gallery wasn't part of her defense strategy. "Your Honor," Vance said, her voice uncertain, "I need a moment to consult with my clients." But my father had moved beyond consultation. He was hyperventilating now, his hand pressed to his chest. My mother was crying not the delicate tears of remorse, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world was collapsing. "I need medical assistance," my father gasped, and suddenly the courtroom was in chaos. Bailiffs were calling for paramedics, the judge was demanding order, and lawyers were conferring in urgent whispers. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, watching my parents fall apart just as completely as I had in that hospital room. The difference was that I had been alone. They had each other, they had their lawyer, they had a room full of people trying to help them, and they still couldn't handle the reality of what they had done. The paramedics arrived within minutes. My father was having a panic attack, Not a heart attack, but they transported him to the hospital as a precaution. My mother went with him, leaving Patricia Vance to request a continuance. This is clearly a very emotional situation for all involved, the judge said, her voice dry. We'll reschedule for next month. I trust both defendants will be fit to proceed at that time. Mitchell found me in the hallway afterward. Well, he said, that's not exactly how I expected the hearing to go. Did you see their faces? I asked. They really thought I was gone. They actually believed they would never have to face what they did. The DA is even less interested in a plea deal now, Mitchell told me. Your parents' reaction in there. It didn't look like the behavior of people who were merely trying to help their daughter's finances during a difficult time. Over the next month, as we prepared for the rescheduled hearing, more details emerged. My parents had not just taken my money, they had told people I was likely to die or remain in a vegetative state. They had held what amounted to a pre-funeral, accepting condolences from neighbors and family friends. They had even canceled the phone service to my apartment and put a forwarding address on my mail to their house. They were erasing you, Mitchell explained, systematically removing you from existence while keeping your money. The rescheduled hearing was different. My parents had clearly been coached by their lawyer. They sat straight, avoided looking at me, and answered only when directly questioned. But I could see the tremor in my mother's hands, and the way my father's jaw was clenched so tightly it must have hurt. This time, I was called to testify. As I walked to the witness stand, I passed directly by the defense table. My mother whispered, "Sarah, please," so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I didn't look at her. Under oath, I told the story simply and factually. The coma, the abandonment, the discovery of the theft, the forged documents. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. Miss Chen, the prosecutor asked, when you discovered what your parents had done, how did that make you feel? Patricia Vance objected. Relevance, Your Honor. I'll allow it, the judge said. I looked out at the courtroom, at my parents sitting with their heads down, at the strangers in the gallery who had come to witness justice being done. Betrayed, I said. When I was at my most vulnerable, when I needed them most, they decided I wasn't worth their time or their love. They took everything I had worked for and left me with nothing. Not just money, they took my security, my ability to rebuild my life after the worst thing that had ever happened to me. They stole my future. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When it was over, the judge found probable cause on all charges and scheduled the case for trial. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Closure. Not the completion of justice that would come at trial, but the satisfaction of being seen, of being heard, of proving that I had not only survived but thrived despite their abandonment. My parents were waiting by their car in the parking lot. When they saw me, they approached hesitantly, like people approaching a dangerous animal. Sarah, my father said, we need to talk. Now you want to talk? I replied. Where were you when I was lying in that hospital bed? Where were you when I woke up with nothing? My mother was crying again. We thought you were going to die, the doctors said. The doctors said I might not recover, I corrected. There's a difference between might not and will not. But even if I had remained in a vegetative state, that gave you the right to steal from me? We were trying to protect your assets, my father said weakly. By putting them in your own account? By forging power of attorney documents? By disappearing from my life completely? They had no answer for that because there was no answer. They had made a calculated decision that I was no longer worth their investment of time or emotion, and they had acted accordingly. Sarah, please, my mother said. We're family. No, I said, and the word came out harder than I had intended. Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't erase each other from existence. I walked away from them and didn't look back. The trial took place 6 months later. By then, I had rebuilt much of my life. I was working full-time again. I had moved to a better apartment. And I was even dating someone, a physical therapist I had met during my recovery, who understood both my journey and my need for independence. My parents pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and 2 years in prison. They had hoped for probation, but the judge was unsympathetic. "This court has seen many cases of financial abuse," Judge Morrison said during sentencing, "but rarely one where the victims were so completely vulnerable and the betrayal so thoroughly calculated. Your daughter was fighting for her life while you were stealing her future. Prison is not only appropriate but necessary." I watched from the gallery as they were led away in handcuffs. My father looked back at me once, his expression unreadable. My mother kept her eyes down. I felt empty. Not satisfied, not vindicated, not sad. Just empty. This was justice, but it wasn't healing. That would have to come from somewhere else. After the sentencing, I walked outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. Mitchell joined me on the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like it's over," I said. "Finally over. Any regrets?" I thought about it. "About pressing charges? About losing my parents? Yes, but I didn't lose them in that courtroom. I lost them in a hospital room 3 years ago, when they decided I wasn't worth fighting for. A year later, I received a letter in prison. It was from my mother, written in her careful handwriting on regulation prison stationery. She wrote about remorse and forgiveness, and wanting to rebuild our relationship when she was released. I read it once and threw it away. Some betrayals are too complete to come back from. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. My parents had made their choice when they thought I couldn't hold them accountable. Now they had to live with the consequences, just as I had learned to live with mine. The difference was that I had built something new from the ashes of what they had destroyed. I had friends who had proven their loyalty, work that gave me purpose, and a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. I had a life worth living, earned through my own effort and determination. My parents had each other in their guilt. As far as I was concerned, that was more than they deserved. On the 3-year anniversary of my accident, I visited the site where it had happened. It was just an intersection now, unmarked and unremarkable. Traffic flowed through it as if nothing had ever happened there. But something had happened there. I had died, in a way, and been reborn into someone stronger. Someone who understood that survival isn't about avoiding betrayal or abandonment. It's about rebuilding when those things happen. It's about discovering that you are more resilient than you ever imagined. Standing at that intersection, I realized that my parents had given me an unexpected gift. By abandoning me, they had forced me to discover my own strength. By betraying me, they had taught me the true value of loyalty. By stealing from me, they had shown me that security comes not from money in the bank, but from confidence in your own ability to survive and thrive. I drove home to my apartment, to my life, to my future. Behind me, the intersection faded in my rearview mirror, just another piece of road in a journey that was far from over. My parents would be released from prison eventually. They would have to rebuild their lives, just as I had rebuilt mine, but we would do so separately, as strangers who once knew each other, but who had chosen different paths. I had chosen survival. They had chosen abandonment, and in the end, that made all the difference.